Hey everyone, Michelle Seidling here with another episode of Food Experience Unplugged. Today we'll explore how to reduce the risk of dementia through diet and lifestyle choices. Here to help us do that is behavior expert Lisa Paglia Skinner. This podcast is available on multiple platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others. Please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to be informed as new episodes become available. If you enjoyed today's episode or any of our episodes, please rate and review the podcast on your favorite platform. As always, be sure to check out our website at foodexperienceunplugged.com for some resources as you begin your health journey. Lisa Skinner, welcome to Food Experience Unplugged.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate being here and sharing all this fascinating information with your followers.
Well, I am so happy to have you here as a behavior expert. And today we're talking about dementia and things that we can do to prevent or at least minimize the chances of getting that in our later years. So to start out with, though, will you introduce yourself and tell us what brought you to this point in your career and in your life, and why you're focused on dementia?
Sure. I have been working in this profession for over 25 years. And I started out as a community counselor in an assisted living / memory care facility. And this is a topic that really is near and dear to my heart because I've personally had 8 of my own family members succumb to a brain disease that causes dementia. 5 of those had relatives and 3 were through marriage. So a lot of personal experience with this. And I really found working with the families, counseling them, I also run support groups, that I have that extra special understanding and empathy towards what they're going through. And I think really what led me to this point, other than all the stars just lined up perfectly, here I am. But rewind 40 plus years, my grandmother was my very first experience with a relative. And I was pretty close to my grandmother. She only lived a couple miles away. I spent a lot of time with her. I knew her very, very well. She was a very subdued, quiet, tiny lady. And she started developing these symptoms when she was living alone. And the thing that really left a huge impression on me with my grandmother is she was having hallucinations and delusions and paranoia. These are just some of the behaviors and symptoms that are common with Alzheimer's disease. And she was imagining all sorts of things, birds living in her mattress and coming out at night and pecking at her face, and rats crawling along her walls, and men trying to harm her, and people stealing things from her. And she was so convincing because she honestly believed these things. And the thing that really left the huge impression on me, and I think is all part of this path I've been on all these years, is she was calling the police on a daily basis. These things she was believing and seeing, and finally, they were so tired of having my grandmother call them. They tracked my mother down. They came over to our house, and they said to my mother, I was sitting right there, "You've got to do something about this woman. She's a nut," they said. "We cannot keep, providing resources to go over there every time a bird comes out of her mattress and pecks her face." And that really, really hit below the belt for me because I knew my grandmother was not a nut. She was this very, very sweet lady. And at the time, they didn't know a lot about Alzheimer's disease. As a matter of fact, they didn't even call it that. They called it senile dementia. But it really carried a stigma with it. And the stigma was the person was a nut. They're gone. They're off their rocker. And they told my mother, "You got to do something with her. We can't keep responding to these calls." So that stayed with me forever. And then I just kind of, when I was in college, I was trying to decide what I wanted to specialize in. And I ended up getting a degree in human behavior, which always fascinated me, kind of what makes people behave the way they do. And kind of the path took me to becoming a community counselor in the elder care world, and really understanding the pain that family members were going through when they had a loved one who was suffering from dementia. This is a long, drawn out illness. The average is 8 to 12 years. My grandmother, she had it for over 20 years, and that was from the onset of the symptoms.
Mm.
Had it for years prior to that, because most people aren't diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease till they're already in their mid stage, because the symptomology, the signs, the behaviors are all very, very subtle at first. So when
Mm.
it becomes obvious, they're already have progressed to about the mid stage. So, I really realized that I had a knack for understanding people's pain and their plight. And I, had been through it with several of my own family members. I got my degree in human behavior. I studied Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and ran support groups. I ended up writing a book, um, and it brought me to really wanting to raise awareness for people of how to better live with this disease, from a communication standpoint with their loved ones, to help caregivers have an easier time caring for people, because I think one of the most important things that people don't understand is this is a science of decoding what's happening to the brain and learning an entirely different way of communicating with people who are cognitively impaired. They can't articulate things to us the way healthy brained people can. It actually can be done if um, learn the tips and the techniques, and exactly what's happening to the brains of your loved ones.
Wow, and you went through that 5 times with 5 different family members or through marriage, all of
8
these different
altogether,
experiences.
5 were blood relatives, so that
Okay.
puts me in that high risk category myself. So I've done a lot of research. Um, People ask me all the time, you have so many family members that have succumbed to dementia. Aren't you worried about developing it yourself? Of course. Of course. But what I've also come to learn is, just because it is so, seems to run in my family, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'll get it.
Mm.
So, there's a lot of research that's been done on what people can actually do to minimize the risk of developing it later in life. Although there's nothing set in stone. If you do this, you won't get it. No, I don't want to kind of give people false hopes about that, because anybody can come down with dementia. But there are many risk factors that increase a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So the key is to the risk factors that are modifiable. There are certain risk factors that you can't do anything about, like age. Age is the number one risk factor to developing Alzheimer's disease. Can't
Mm.
about that. So we're stuck with that as being everybody's risk factor. But there are many risk factors that are what we call modifiable. And if you are able to modify those risk factors, then you negate them as increasing your risk, and you will end up lowering your risk.
Okay. Wow. And now, were you able to assist as a counselor or as a support to any of these family members? I know with your grandmother, you were still pretty young at that point, but with other family members, did you assist at all?
I mean, as far as in the caregiving,
Yes, or just in the counseling or in providing, things that they may need.
oh, yes. Yes. I actually, when I left the senior living industry, I started my own counseling service. It was a counseling / placement service. So I helped families who were not quite ready, and they were sitting on the fence as to whether or not they wanted to place their loved one with professionals. I would help them through that entire process and help them find the best environment for their loved one's circumstances. support
That's
groups. And yeah, so I've had a lot of interaction with family members and caregivers on how to make this journey just a little less daunting for them, because it's it's a very sad, tragic situation, and I've really seen it divide families apart, and uh, so many different components to it. I guess it's very complicated.
sure. Now, if we could take a step back for a minute. Now, you've spoken about dementia and Alzheimer's, and perhaps there are other brain disorders, but what exactly are the differences between those two and also with other brain disorders that people get?
That's a great question, and it's a confusing terminology to most people. A lot of people that I've worked with believe that dementia and Alzheimer's are two separate diseases, and they're actually not. So Alzheimer's disease is a brain disease that causes dementia. There are actually over 100 brain diseases that cause dementia. So in that sense, dementia is really a broad term used to describe the symptoms that you see with a brain disease. Just like having the flu or a cold, most of us can relate to that because most of us have had either the flu or a cold at some point in their life. People develop different symptoms when they come down with the virus. Some people get horrible body aches and chills or an upset tummy or a terrible headache, but not everybody who comes down with the flu or not everybody that comes down with a cold displays the exact same symptoms. This is exactly true with brain disease. So when you refer to dementia, you're really referring to the symptoms and the signs that show up as a result of whichever one of the brain diseases is causing the dementia or causing the brain disease. And really what it comes down to is what part of the brain is being damaged will determine which of the behaviors and the signs and the symptomologies you end up displaying. My grandmother is a great example of that because she 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 showed the gamut of the worst behaviors. Not everybody gets the hallucinations. Not everybody has the delusions. Not everybody shows the paranoia behavior that she did. There are some really common behaviors that are symptomatic of dementia, but pretty much every case is different. I mean, I have seen from very mild to my grandmother, which was probably one of the most extreme cases that I've ever seen.
Okay. Wow. So dementia is kind of the overall umbrella, and there's Alzheimer's in there, and there may be other types of brain disorders.
Yeah, some of the more common ones that we've heard of is Parkinson's disease. Now, Parkinson's disease is interesting because people can have it with the dementia or without the dementia. Michael Fox is a perfect example of somebody who's been living with Parkinson's disease for probably close to 30 years now, but he doesn't have the dementia with it. Typically, he's perfect. I've seen people with Parkinson's disease that have severe dementia, and they pretty much behave the same way people with Alzheimer's disease. There's vascular dementia, which is probably the second most common type of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the number one most common type. And vascular disease or vascular dementia is actually caused by strokes and strokes. A lot of people have strokes and it doesn't affect their cognitive function, but a lot of people have strokes and they develop vascular dementia because of the damage that's done to the blood flow in the brain. And then, like I said, there's over 100, but there's Huntington's disease, there's Parkinson's, there's Lewy body. There are a lot of different brain disorders or brain diseases that can cause dementia. A lot of the symptoms and the behaviors are very similar. The hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is short-term memory loss and lack of judgment and reasoning, but sometimes personality disorders or severe personality changes in people. Whereas kind of the hallmark of Parkinson's disease is not so much with the short-term memory loss, but of hallucinations. And
Mm,
also that seems to be common with Lewy body disease as well, the one that Robin Williams was diagnosed with.
okay. Wow. A lot of different types. Now,
And then there's also mixed dementia, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. You can have two different brain diseases or several different brain diseases going on at the same time.
okay.
Just
Wow.
limited to Alzheimer's disease. It can have several, but they call that mixed dementia. So
Mm,
there could be a lot going on in different parts of the brain that cause the different behaviors and symptomologies.
okay. That's very interesting. Just the gamut of different diseases and how to approach that. Now, when it comes to diet and lifestyle choices, are there things that people can do? I know we talk, a lot about dementia and Alzheimer's. Does diet and lifestyle also play a role in these many other different types of brain disorders?
Can, yes. So as we discussed a little while ago, there are so many different brain diseases that can cause dementia. The most common one is Alzheimer's disease. And the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is when plaques and tangles form in the brain. And
Okay.
typically, the most common one is that it attacks the short term memory. But there are other variants that attack other parts of the brain that affect um, our personalities, our ability to use sound judgment or reasoning. But the short term memory really seems, the loss of short term memory really seems to be the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. And what happens is through the progression of the disease, the short term memory is affected the most. And the way I like to explain it to people, because it's really easy to understand when I use this analogy, is think of the short term memory as a light switch. Now, when you go into your home, you want to go into the kitchen, it's dark. To turn the light on, you flip the switch up. When you're finished,
Mhm,
you leave and you flip the switch down, and that turns the lights off. So
mhm,
think of the short term memory as it's being attacked by these plaques and tangles, which are proteins. Sometimes the switch gets flipped on, and sometimes it's flipped off. In
mhm.
the earlier stages of the disease, your short term memory is functioning and intact on more than it's off.
Okay.
Sometimes it just switches off. And then people start talking about things that their loved ones and their family members have no idea what they're talking about. They're in a different reality because the short term memory basically is flipped off for that given time, whether it's a minute, an hour, or 5 days. And those people are pulling from their long term memories because the long term memories stay intact till the end of the
Mm,
days.
okay.
So I could be sitting there talking to, my mother in law, and we're having you know, a normal conversation. And then out of the blue, she jumps up. This is a true story. She jumps up and starts talking about having to go home to fix her husband dinner. And he's going to be all worried about her just out of nowhere. Well, he's had passed away 5 years earlier.
Mm,
But
okay.
for that moment, that switch got flipped off, and she's pulling from her long-term memories, and she believes her husband is still alive and is sitting at home waiting for her to come home. This happens
Wow.
all the time. This is very common. And then as you progress through the various stages and it continues to worsen, most people by the end of the disease have no short-term memory at all. So they are only pulling from their long-term memory, and in their reality, they are living in some time frame from their past. And that varies from person to person. I've seen people believe that they're children and they're still living with their parents. Their parents have been long gone, but they have to get to
Wow.
their home where their parents live. With my mother-in-law, her time frame landed her in her adolescent years.
Wow.
So this was the reason why when her short-term memory was switched off, she didn't recognize my husband. her son because in her mind, she was 12, 13 years old, hadn't even gotten married yet, let alone had children. So she thought my husband was her brother. She knew him some way, but she couldn't possibly have a grown man for a son because in her mind, she was a teenager. So this is what happens to the brain and why people all of a sudden start kind of believing an alternate reality from ours. So this is one of the things that I teach is listen for the cues. Now, obviously, when I'm sitting there having a normal conversation with my mother-in-law, and then all of a sudden she jumps out of the chair in a panic, thinking that Marty, her husband, is waiting for her at home, worried about her, will be mad because she's not there to fix him dinner. Those are all cues for me that switch just got flipped off. She's now reality that I'm in. And one of the and our the correct responses are actually counterintuitive because most people's gut or knee-jerk reaction to that behavior is to say, "Oh no, Mom, don't you remember? Marty died 5 years ago." If I said that to her, it could be like she was hearing it for the very first time, and it could cause stress and panic because in her mind, he's still alive and well and at home waiting for her. So really be careful of how you react and respond to that switch being shut off and people pulling from their long-term memories because it can do a lot of damage if it's not approached in a real sensitive way. They honestly believe it. There's nothing anybody can do or say to change the mind or the beliefs of the person who has the dementia, and that short-term switch just got shut off. Our recommendation, what we encourage people to do is what we call join their reality.
Okay.
So what I said to my mother-in-law was, "Oh, Marianne, don't worry. Marty just called. I just got off the phone with him. He knows you're here. He wants you to stay and have a really nice visit. And he said he'll see you when you get home." And that put the whole thing to bed.
Wow.
We moved on to a different,
That is crazy. And just the diversity of experiences. But in all of these things, what role do diet and lifestyle choices have on addressing these many different brain disorders and, levels of intensity?
So I mentioned that there are risk factors. The number one risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease, we'll talk about that one because that's the most common brain disease that people get that causes dementia, is age. With the exception of what's called early onset dementia, which shows up, and it's genetic, it runs in people's families. It shows up before the age of 65, where the common form of Alzheimer's disease typically shows up after the age of 65. But still, because it's genetically predisposed, if people are carrying the gene for early onset, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll get it. You have probably about a 50% chance. Now, the more common type of Alzheimer's disease, your age is the number one risk factor. There's nothing we can do about that. It's a fixed risk factor. But as I mentioned, there are quite a few risk factors that are modifiable and controllable that we can do something about. Diet is one of them. So the recommendation by the medical community is to try to eat a more like Mediterranean type of diet with whole grains and fruits and vegetables and lean meats, and try to stay away from saturated fats and sugar. Anything white, like your potatoes, your white rice, your white flour. Those have all been shown to increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So if you modify your lifestyle, another, I think it was the second highest risk factor, second to age in developing Alzheimer's disease, surprisingly, is cardiovascular disease. But that's a controllable and a modifiable. Even if you have cardiovascular disease, which of course includes hypertension and high blood pressure, you can manage those with medications. If you're managing those with medications, then it negates that as being a high risk factor and gets you back more to a lower risk factor. And there are so many different things that are considered risk factors that we can modify with lifestyle choices. Diet, exercise has been shown to be extremely important in helping lower your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But there are some other ones that are kind of surprising, like your level of education and shown to either increase or decrease your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So if you have a higher education at a younger age, your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is lower. But that just because you only graduated from high school doesn't mean you cannot change that. You can take classes. One of the best things that you can do to stimulate your brain is learn a language, because your brain has to work really hard to translate languages from one to another. So you're really getting a lot of benefit from learning a foreign language. Your brain's really having to work hard to decipher or translate from English to French or English to Spanish and vice versa. So that's high on the list. Reading, anything that's challenging. Things that you don't know. Learning a musical instrument is another really good thing to help keep your brain stimulated and keep those neurons firing. So lifestyle, diet, exercise, socialization is another one that has been found to help reduce your risk. We're human beings, we're social beings. We were wired to be social animals. So that has also shown up in the studies that has helped. Depression can be a risk factor in increasing your development of Alzheimer's disease. So there was a really interesting study done in 1986 where they took 678 Catholic nuns and studied them. And the reason why this was such a valuable study is because these nuns all had similar lifestyles. They had similar diets. They had a similar adult lives, income, social status. They didn't have all these variables that played into that. They kind of had to separate out to make it a really good study. And they found that the nuns who spoke multiple languages, 2 to 4 languages, even though after they died and they found the plaques and tangles in their brains, they were asymptomatic. They showed no signs of dementia, even though their brains were filled with the plaques and the tangles that caused dementia. Wrote, and they also determined that they all wrote biographies when they were in their 20s. And they read the biographies, and the biographies they found of the nuns that used more sophisticated language and words and kind of more deep ideas to develop Alzheimer's disease were the ones that did. So the point of this study really, I think, helped point us in the direction that lifestyle and all these things that we just talked about, including keeping your brain stimulated and exercise, because it's like, using your muscles. If you don't use them, you lose them and they atrophy, just like any other muscle in your body. You have to keep your brain healthy too. So these are all really fascinating findings in many studies that have been conducted over probably the last 4 decades or so, because a lot of information is pointing to the fact that there are things that people can do starting in younger years that will help them reduce their risk. I mean, we always think of Alzheimer's disease or some of these other brain diseases as old people's diseases. And typically they don't start showing up until you're in your at least mid 60s or later. What people weren't aware of, including myself until I did the research, was there are things that we can start doing today that won't guarantee we won't develop Alzheimer's or other brain diseases, but we know now that it will help reduce our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So I find this very, very fascinating. I've made a lot of lifestyle changes in my life after learning these things because I'm high risk anyway, because it runs in my family. And I have other risk factors that contribute to that too. So I've made some very dramatic lifestyle changes because I know that anything that I do today will help reduce my risk when I am at the age where brain disease starts showing up and ravaging our brains and causing cognitive dysfunction.
Wow, that is amazing. I love that study and just how they were able to, look at these different situations. They all had with the nuns, for example, they all had the plaque, but they, responded differently. Now, for you in, making some lifestyle changes and diet changes, how was it easy for you? Was that, risk of dementia kind of the driving force, or did you have some was it difficult to make those changes?
Very difficult. But and it didn't happen overnight. But I pretty
Sure.
much cut out of my diet all white flour. I haven't completely cut out sugar because I crave sugar, but I have cut way, way, way back on it. And it's not just the diet. I hardly eat any red meat. It's mostly very lean meats. I don't eat potatoes, but I do eat whole grain rice or brown rice. So I don't have to completely go with that, but I mostly eat vegetables, steamed vegetables, and very lean meats. But, once in a while I have a pizza, but I don't beat myself up about it because,
Mm.
you can't, I think it's difficult to do 100%. But yeah, it was hard. It was hard because I was used to just basically, if I wanted to have macaroni and cheese, I had macaroni and cheese. And, the way things have been with our lifestyles in the last year with COVID, we are leaning a lot towards these comfort foods now because we are all in a very stressful situation. So that part of it's been hard. I can't tell you how many times the thought of macaroni and cheese sounded so comforting to me, but I know how bad it is for you. And I have to look down the road. I have been around so many people with Alzheimer's disease and other brain diseases that cause dementia that
Mhm.
it's worth eliminating some of these things and doing some of these modifications not to have to live with that disease later on in life.
Mm. Now, if people have an onset of symptoms, does it automatically mean, okay, they're headed down that road, or can they, if they did not make any modifiable changes, beforehand, is there something that they can do early on at that early diagnosis, or at least having symptoms that they can do to maybe at least minimize what may be coming down the road?
Well, there is memory loss associated with the normal aging process. And this is one of
Mhm.
the reasons why it's so difficult to really determine Alzheimer's disease or other brain diseases in the earliest stages because the signs and the symptoms are very, very subtle. And a lot of times they're just very similar to some of the things that happen to us as a part of the normal aging process, like, oh, where are my glasses? I don't know where oh, they're on top of my head, or I can't find my keys. All the can't, we're having a conversation with somebody and all of a sudden you can't think of that name. That happens to me all the time. But that's part of normal aging.
Okay.
As it advances and gets more serious, that doesn't happen with normal aging. It happens with brain disease. So when it becomes really obvious and blatant that there's something seriously wrong, the disease typically has already progressed to the mid stages. And a lot of family members say, oh yeah, now that I think about it, there were signs that mom was struggling with certain things, but we just thought it was normal forgetfulness. So usually if it's progressed and past just the signs of normal aging, then the next stage is called mild cognitive impairment. Not everybody who suffers from mild cognitive impairment. Now that's a little, your memory loss and your dysfunction, your cognitive ability is worse with mild cognitive impairment than it is with the normal aging process, the memory loss with normal aging process, but not as bad as full-blown dementia. The next step, mild cognitive impairment, is full-blown dementia. Not everybody, and this is really interesting, and it's going to address your question. Not everybody who's showing signs of mild cognitive impairment advance to dementia. So, to answer your question, yes, there are things that we can do to help us from progressing to dementia. And that's all the things that we have talked about. Keeping your brain active, exercising, what you put in your body, those are all things that can help. But even as importantly, managing health conditions, underlying health conditions, diabetes, congestive or cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, hypertension. These are all things that increase our risk to developing Alzheimer's. Sleep apnea surprised me. There's a correlation between people who suffer from sleep apnea and developing Alzheimer's disease later on in life. Depression is one of the risk factors. Not being isolated. Like if you're an older person and you have no interaction with other people, your adult children live in other states and you sit alone most of your time, that is a high risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease, because you're not socializing with people and you're not stimulating anything. Your brain, what happens with Alzheimer's disease is truly your brain does atrophy and shrink, just like any other muscles that you don't use. So that's kind of the key to this discussion, is to stay active, to be social, thinking positively. That's another thing that they've shown in the nun study, that the nuns who wrote in their journals very positive, had positive thoughts about their life and versus the ones that were more negative, the positive thinkers didn't develop Alzheimer's disease as much as the negative thinkers, even though upon their death and an autopsy, they showed plaques and tangles in their brains.
Interesting.
So it gets really complicated because there are so many things that matter, it seems. And I don't know that realistically we can do every single thing, but I think the more it's becoming pretty obvious that the more we can do and we can modify and we can control, we will lower our risk of developing brain disease later on in life.
Okay. Wow. That's eye-opening just to think
It
of
really
just the
is.
gamut. But the good news is that no matter what stage, even if you don't have it, you can start doing those things. Those diet and lifestyle choices, are applicable to everyone. Everyone can start doing these things and be able to, prevent it, to minimize it, and be able to really, really focus on their own health.
That's very true. And I think raising the awareness of this is really important. Almost everybody I've ever talked to seems to have a story. They know somebody who has the disease. They have a relative. They have a spouse. It's a very difficult disease to go through for a lot of different reasons. But one of the main reasons is because it lasts such a long time.
Yes, and you don't know how long. For some of the people you've worked with, the time was short. Others was quite long.
Yeah.
Definitely. Wow, that is amazing just to understand that whole gamut, but the importance of the diet and lifestyle choices. And I'm so grateful for those that you continue to work with and your own,
Thank you.
having the courage to make your own lifestyle choices as well and diet.
Another thing that comes into play that a lot of people don't realize is race and gender also play into being higher or lower risk factors.
Mhm.
Or women
Okay.
um, develop Alzheimer's disease than men. Not sure why. Might be because statistically women outlive men,
Mhm.
but more women develop that. So gender is a factor, race is a factor. There's just so many factors. So the more you can manage and control, the more you will minimize your risk of developing it. And the reason why I say that is, again, to emphasize anybody can get this disease.
Absolutely.
It doesn't play
Wow.
favorites.
No, no,
I mean,
definitely
my
not.
mother's family is a perfect example. My grandmother had it. She had four siblings. My mom was the oldest. She had had multiple strokes over a 20-year period, but her brain was in perfect health.
Wow.
Did not develop dementia, vascular dementia. And then the next sister under her had Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
And two under that, they seemed to be fine. And then the youngest sister, who's now in her 70s, she developed Alzheimer's disease. So
Okay.
there's an example of how it runs in families, but it didn't hit everybody. Three,
Mm.
the let's see, 5 kids and the mother, six. So 50% of the family developed Alzheimer's disease. My,
Wow.
theoretically should have had vascular dementia because of all the strokes she had, but she was as sharp as a tack till the day she died. So
Wow.
really, the point I'm trying to make here is it really doesn't discriminate. It just picks and chooses. And anybody is vulnerable or susceptible. So that's the whole point here, is that there are things that we can start doing now that will help us avoid it later on.
Absolutely. And that's the good news in all of this is that there's so many things that you indicated that we can do to prevent or minimize this.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and the sad part about it is there are, let's see, 5.5 million people suffering from Alzheimer's disease in the United States today.
Hmm.
Next, by the year 2050, that number will at least double, if not more than double. Primarily because the baby boomers are a huge generation, and we're at the age of, being at that high risk factor of age. We're a large population, but
Sure.
um, those numbers are staggering. They're compelling to think that in just less than 25 years or 30 years, those numbers are going to double, if not more than double, of the people who develop Alzheimer's disease, and that's worldwide.
Wow. That's incredible. Just
So
just the magnitude of it all.
it is. How are we going to care for all these people? Who's going to pay for it? It's unbelievably expensive to care for people with dementia, and they can't take care of themselves once they reach a certain stage. They're completely
Mm.
dependent on somebody else to perform their activities of daily living and to care for them. And because it's such a long, drawn out disease, I mean, we're talking years of care.
Mm.
So if there's things that we can do now that will avoid us being in that situation, either as a family member or the person getting the disease, makes sense to maybe implement some of those into our life.
Definitely. Well, Lisa, how can people get in contact with you?
So the best way is through my blog, and it's on Facebook. It's the same name as the title of my book. So on Facebook, if you just search "Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost," that'll take you to my blog. And there is also, my book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And I post a lot of these things that we've been talking about on my blog. And if anybody has any questions that they want to ask me, please feel free to post your questions. I will answer them. I'm here to help people and make their lives a little less stressful, a little easier going through this journey. Because people have told me time and time again over the last 25, 30 years, a lot of this information is so difficult to find on just from the challenges that exist on a day-to-day basis. So if I can make somebody's world a little easier, that's what I'm here for.
Lisa, fabulous. I know that you can help so many people. You are already and will continue to as we learn more and more about these brain disorders and how to prevent and the things that you can do. Lisa, it's been amazing and it's been a real eye-opener and a pleasure having you on the show today.
Well, thanks again for inviting me. I really enjoyed it too. And hopefully this helps a lot of people out there. That's my goal.